She had nothing, no home, no one waiting for her. And that morning, she was walking the streets of downtown Seoul, asking strangers for work when the world put a choice in front of her that most people would have failed. Poverty and power don't belong in the same sentence. But sometimes life forces them into the same moment, and everything depends on what the poorest person in that moment decides to do. Stay with me. And if you believe that one honest choice can rewrite your entire future, hit like and subscribe to this channel before we even begin, because what Nia did next is going to stay with you. Also, tell us where you're watching from in the comment section. The morning found Nia the way it always did, before she was ready for it. She woke beneath the overpass near the financial district, where the underside of the concrete held onto the cold long after the sun had already risen above the glass towers. She blinked at the gray ceiling of her world. Graffiti, rust stains, the echo of early commuter traffic above her head, and felt the familiar pull of her body's accounting. One day since her last meal. 14 hours since the last sip of water. Her throat was dry sandpaper. Her stomach had moved past growling into something quieter and more dangerous. A deep, hollow stillness that made it hard to think in straight lines. She sat up slowly. Her brown hoodie had ridden up during the night, and the concrete had left its pattern on her forearm. She pressed her hand flat against the ground, steadied herself, and stood. There was a public tap 3 blocks down, near the back wall of a parking structure, yet she walked there with her head up. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had decided long ago that she would not perform her desperation for anyone. She washed her face. She wet her hands and smoothed them over her hair until her curls sat closer to her head. She pulled the hoodie straight. Her jeans were torn at both knees, and her sneakers had split along the left sole, but she was clean. She would be clean. That much she could control. She started at the corner bakery. "Do you need someone for the morning rush?" The man behind the counter looked at her shoes and said no without meeting her eyes. The car wash on the next block was already staffed. The restaurant beside the metro entrance told her they weren't hiring, and then, before she'd even turned to leave, called back a new employee from the stockroom. A woman at a fruit stall listened to her whole pitch, seemed to consider it, and then asked if she had references. When Nia said no, the woman turned back to her produce like the conversation had never happened. By early afternoon, the sun was hammering the pavement, and Nia's dizziness had grown a slow, persistent pulse behind her eyes. She stopped at the corner across from the Hansung Financial Tower, 42 floors of blue glass that caught the sunset like a mirror, reflecting a version of the city that was cleaner and colder than the one she was standing in. She wasn't looking at the building. She was watching the entrance. Specifically, she was watching the valets, calculating whether any of them might need a runner for the evening shift. That was when the convoy arrived. 3 black vehicles. The first 2 moved in formation, slowing before the tower entrance with the synchronized precision of people who had done this 1,000 times. The third, a long, matte black sedan, stopped with a quiet authority that made the space around it feel different. Charged. The driver stepped out first, scanning the street in each direction before reaching for the rear door. The man who emerged did not hurry. He was tall, early 40s maybe, though his stillness made him seem ageless. Black suit, cut with the kind of precision that cost more than Nia had seen in her life. A gold watch caught the last angle of afternoon light. He was speaking Korean into a phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and even. And whatever he was saying, the 2 men who fell into step beside him didn't interrupt. The guards near the entrance stiffened as he approached. Not the polite stiffening of people showing respect. the stiffening of people remembering what they were supposed to be. Nia had heard the name before in the way that people heard weather warnings, distantly, with the understanding that the storm was somewhere else. Jaemin Park. The rumors ran in two directions at once: legitimate empire and underground dynasty, each feeding the other. Business tycoon by the city's official record. Something older and harder by every other account. He walked past without looking at her, without looking at anyone. And something fell from the inside of his coat. It hit the pavement 6 feet from where Nia was standing with a soft, weighted sound. A wallet. Thick, dark leather. It landed face down near the edge of the curb, and no one, not the driver still pulling the car forward, not the guards holding the door, not the men who'd flanked him, nobody stopped. Nobody noticed. The revolving door of the tower swallowed him, and the lobby absorbed him. And just like that, he was gone. Nia looked at the wallet. She looked at the entrance. She looked back. She picked it up. The leather was cool and soft under her fingers. The kind of softness that only came from expensive things, things that had been maintained. She turned it over, opened it. Her hands stopped moving. Cash. Stacked in folded rows, organized by denomination. Korean won and American dollars and what looked like euros. More than she'd touched in a year. More than her father had made in 2. Beside the cash, cards. Matte black, no embossing. The kind that didn't list a credit limit because there wasn't one. A platinum access chip sealed in a slim case. And tucked in the ID window, his name, Jaemin Park. The ground stayed solid beneath her feet, but the rest of the world seemed to tilt slightly. Behind her, she heard movement. 2 teenage boys had watched her pick it up. One of them leaned in. "Ioni." "Sister." His voice was barely above a breath. "That's your miracle. Don't overthink it, just go." The other one nodded. No one saw. Just walk. Her stomach contracted, a violent, involuntary reminder that it had been a very long time since yesterday's half a cup of rice. She could feel the weight of the wallet. She could feel what was inside it. She could feel every kilometer of bus route that would take her somewhere safe. Somewhere with a floor and a door and food. She stood there with all of it in her hands. And then she heard something else. Not from the street. From somewhere older. "You can lose everything, Nia, but never lose who you are." Her father's voice. Sitting across from her at the kitchen table after the factory shift, hands wrapped around a mug of barley tea, saying the only thing he believed without reservation. He had died with nothing. He had kept that one thing. She closed the wallet. She turned toward the building. The guard's expression moved through several stages in the span of 4 seconds. Dismissal, suspicion, and then, when she held up the wallet and said, "I need to return this," something closer to alarm. His hand was around her wrist before she finished the sentence. "Thief." It wasn't a question. It was a broadcast. Heads turned. A woman in a blazer crossed to the far side of the entrance. A man with a briefcase slowed, stared, moved on. Someone pulled out their phone. The second guard arrived from the other side, and together they moved her, not gently, through the lobby doors and into an elevator that went up without asking her where she wanted to go. The room they brought her to was all glass and controlled light. A long table. Leather chairs. And Jaemin Park standing at the far end, phone still in hand, looking at her with eyes that gave nothing away. "You tried to steal from me." It wasn't a question either. "I found it on the street after you walked past." Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I came to return it." He held out his hand. She crossed the room and placed the wallet in his palm. He opened it. Checked the cash. All there. Fanned through the cards. All there. And then his fingers moved to a section near the spine, a fold she hadn't even noticed. And he pulled out something small and silver, a tracking chip. Flat, thumbnail-sized. His expression didn't change, but something in the room did. "Where is the second tracker?" he asked quietly. Nia blinked. "I don't know what that means. There should be a tracking device in the external pocket." "I didn't open any pockets. I didn't take anything." The silence stretched. If she had planted a device, she wouldn't describe the one she'd taken. If she were lying, she would have said she didn't know about any tracker at all. The fact that she'd confirmed one without knowing its purpose told him something. He studied her the way she imagined he studied everything, measuring, weighing, deciding. Torn jeans, split sneakers, hollow cheeks, eyes that were tired but not dishonest. "Why return it?" he asked. Because it's yours." He reached into the wallet and pulled out a thick fold of bills, more than she'd held in her lifetime, and held it toward her. She looked at it. Her stomach said yes with everything it had. She shook her head. His expression shifted. Barely. The microscopic recalibration of a man who wasn't often surprised. "You don't want money." "I want work," she said. "I'll clean, I'll run errands, carry inventory, anything." She held her ground. "I just want a fair chance." The room went still. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she had to resist the urge to look away. "Warehouse District," he said finally. 7 a.m. He turned back toward the window. The guards appeared again at the door. Nia walked out of the building into the cooling evening air, her stomach still empty, yet her hands still shaking slightly. But something in her chest was different. Something had shifted. She didn't know yet that she had just passed a test she hadn't been told she was taking. She didn't know that the missing tracker had been removed by someone inside his organization, someone who needed to know where Jae-min would be and when. She didn't know that by returning the wallet, she had interrupted a surveillance operation 3 years in the making. She didn't know any of it. She just walked. And somewhere behind her, in a 42nd floor office that looked out over a city full of secrets, a man who trusted almost no one picked up his phone and made a single call. "Run a background check. The girl who came in tonight." He paused. "She's clean. I already know she's clean. I want to know why." The warehouse district existed in a different city than the one Nia had spent the night in. Same streets, same sky. But down here, past the loading docks and the chain-link fences and the rows of container yards that ran all the way to the river, the rules were different. She felt it before she saw anything specific. The quality of the silence. Too deliberate. Too managed. She arrived at 6:52 a.m. The building was wide and low. Corrugated metal walls painted the color of old water. No signage. 3 men stood outside the main door in civilian clothes. But the way they tracked her approach from 50 meters away told her everything she needed to know about what they actually were. One of them spoke into an earpiece. Another held the door open without a word. Inside, the smell hit her first. Metal, diesel, cold concrete. Crates were stacked 12 feet high along both walls, stamped with shipping codes and origin labels she didn't recognize, ports she couldn't place, manifests in languages she couldn't read. Forklifts moved in the far section with unhurried precision. Men in work gear crossed the floor with the focused quiet of people who had been told, at some point, that questions were not part of their job description. This wasn't corporate business. A man named Kang, short, sharp-eyed, clearly unhappy about her presence, handed her a clipboard and showed her to a steel table near the intake section. "Inventory log," he said. "Shipments come in, you record item count against the manifest. Numbers match, you stamp it. Numbers don't match, you fine me." He said it like it was simple, like it was boring. "Don't touch the crates. But don't talk to anyone in the back section. Don't ask what's inside." She nodded. He left. For the first 2 hours, the work was straightforward. Shipment in, count, log, stamp. She moved through the intake sheets methodically, building a rhythm, and for a little while the rhythm almost made her forget where she was. Then the discrepancies started. A crate logged as electronic components, 48 units that hit the scale at nearly double the listed weight. A sealed pallet relabeled since the original manifest, the old sticker still visible at the corner if you knew to look. An intake date stamped 3 days earlier than the arrival record, which meant either the paperwork had been backdated or the crate had been sitting somewhere it wasn't supposed to be sitting. Nia stared at the numbers for a long moment, and then she picked up her pen and made a quiet notation in the margin. Just a flag. Just a question mark next to a date that didn't make sense. She didn't know that someone was watching when she did it. They came for her near the loading dock at the end of the shift. 2 men, not Kang. She hadn't seen these ones near the intake table. They positioned themselves without hurry, one on each side, and the one on the left leaned in close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke. "You don't fix what you don't understand." His voice was barely above a murmur. Friendly, almost. "This isn't a classroom." The one on the right put a hand on her shoulder. Not a grab. Just pressure. Just a reminder that the hand existed and could do more than rest there. "Stamp what matches," the first one said. "Walk away from what doesn't." They left without waiting for her response. She went back to her spot under the overpass that night. It was gone. The cardboard she'd layered for insulation, the plastic bag with her spare shirt, the small bundle she'd tied with a shoelace and wedged behind the support column. All of it burned. Not accidentally. The scorch marks were too localized, too deliberate. Someone had followed her home. She stood in front of the ash and let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly 30 seconds. The fear, the exhaustion, the part of her that said you knew this would happen, you knew you should have taken the money and disappeared. 30 seconds. Then she thought about the mislabeled crates. She thought about the backdated stamp. She thought about 2 men who needed her to stop asking questions she hadn't even asked out loud yet. Why threaten someone who's already leaving? Unless you're afraid of what she already saw. She found a dry corner under a different overpass, 2 blocks east. She sat with her back against the concrete, knees pulled up, watching the city flicker. She was not leaving. But as she closed her eyes, the thought that kept returning wasn't the men or the fire or even the fear. It was simpler than that. Somewhere in that warehouse, someone already knew which record I flagged. And I never told anyone. Which meant the watcher wasn't outside the organization. The watcher was already in it. The sirens arrived on the 3rd day. Nia heard them before she saw them. A sound that started distant and then multiplied, been closing in from 2 directions at once until the red and blue light was strobing through the warehouse's high windows. Men near the back section moved fast. Crates were covered. Doors slammed. Someone killed the overhead lights in the far bay, which accomplished nothing except making the police lights brighter by contrast. 6 officers entered through the loading dock. 4 more through the front. Nobody moves. Nia didn't move. The raid was focused and efficient. Not random. They knew which section. They knew which row. Within 7 minutes, they had pried open a crate in Bay 4. A crate she recognized. One of the ones with the weight discrepancy she'd flagged. And inside it, beneath a layer of packaged components, were weapons. Compact, military-grade, wrapped in foam sheeting. A detective crossed to Kang with a printout. Who logged Bay 4 intake on Tuesday? Kang looked at the sheet. Then he looked at Naya. The name on the intake record was hers. The interrogation room was a windowless office on the warehouse's upper level that smelled like old coffee and cold metal. Nia sat on one side of a folding table. 2 officers stood near the door, and Jae-min Park stood against the far wall, arms folded, watching her with that same unreadable stillness from the tower, like he was waiting for something he already knew was coming. "Did you alter the records?" he asked. His voice was level, almost gentle. "No." "Did you call the police?" "No." "Your name is on the intake log for the weapons shipment." "I know." She held his eyes. "I didn't sign it." He studied her. The officers exchanged a glance, as she could feel the room's logic settling around her like concrete. The homeless girl, new to the warehouse, no alibi, name already on paper. It was clean. Whoever had done this had done it carefully. She waited for him to make the obvious decision. To hand her over, walk out, and solve the problem in the simplest available way. He didn't. "Pull the camera feeds," he said. One of his men, standing near the door, went very still. "Sir, all of them. Bay 4, the intake desk. The corridor between them. Tuesday. Full day." The room shifted. Not dramatically. Just a degree or two, like the temperature had changed. The officers looked at each other. Kang looked at the floor. They watched the footage in silence. The intake desk camera showed Naya logging 2 shipments on Tuesday afternoon, neither of them Bay 4. It showed her flagging a weight discrepancy in the margin of a manifest. Just a question mark, small and quiet. It showed her leaving her station at 5:40 p.m. The Bay 4 camera showed something else. At 7:15 p.m., after the warehouse had mostly cleared, a man in a gray jacket entered the bay. He moved quickly, with the specific confidence of someone who knew exactly where the cameras were and had already decided they wouldn't matter. He replaced the intake log on the clipboard outside the crate. He initialed the new sheet with a signature that was close to Nia's. Close enough. He was back in the corridor in under 4 minutes. The man in the gray jacket was Park Do-hyun. Jae-min's senior operations captain, 15 years in the organization. The room went completely silent. Do-hyun's jaw tightened, but he didn't run. He stood there while Jae-min looked at the frozen frame on the screen, and the only sound was the low hum of the monitor. "She asks questions," Do-hyun said finally. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it had cracked. "She noticed things she wasn't supposed to notice. She's a liability. I was protecting—" "No." Jaemin's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You were afraid she'd find what you've been hiding." 2 men moved toward Do-hyun without being told. Naya sat still as he was walked out. And as he passed her chair, close enough that she felt the air move, he turned his head and said it quietly, meant only for her. "You don't know who you're protecting." The door closed. Jae-min didn't look at her right away. He stood at the monitor a moment longer, looking at the frozen image of his most trusted captain replacing a dead girl's name with a living one's. Then he turned. For the first time since she'd walked into his tower with his wallet, something in his expression had changed. Not warmth, exactly. Not trust, but the opposite of suspicion. She didn't know yet what Do-hyun's warning meant, but she would. The wallet had been in her hands for less than 3 minutes. That was the detail Jae-min kept returning to. 3 minutes between the drop and the return. No detours, no opportunity to remove anything. His tech team had confirmed what the forensic sweep already suggested. The external pocket's lining had been cut and resealed before the wallet hit the pavement. Whoever removed the second tracker had done it inside the building, before he left for the evening. It's before Nia existed anywhere in the equation. It wasn't lost, his head of security said, setting the report on the desk. It was taken out clean, replaced the lining so you wouldn't notice the weight change. Jae-min didn't respond immediately. He stood at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the city the way he looked at most problems, like it had an answer, and he was simply waiting for it to make itself visible. The wallet was supposed to move, he said finally. Yes, sir. Someone expected it to leave my possession, expected it to pass through hands they could monitor. The tracker in the external pocket had a relay function. If someone downstream had the receiver, they'd know everywhere it went. He turned from the window. Oh, and everyone who touched it. The implication took a moment to settle fully into the room, and when it did, it changed the geometry of everything. The wallet dropping hadn't been careless. It had been engineered. Someone close enough to him to access the coat, close enough to know his schedule, had turned an ordinary object into a moving surveillance node. If Nia hadn't returned it, the wallet would have drifted, bus driver, pawn shop, second-hand dealer, building a map of hands and locations that pointed back toward him through everyone else. She had walked up to his front gate and handed the operation back to him before it could run a single hour. She hadn't known. She'd just been returning something that wasn't hers. In the meeting that followed, his operations advisor, a careful man named Shin, who had been with the organization longer than most, fielded the security briefing with practiced calm. He asked the right questions. He expressed the appropriate concern. He suggested 2 plausible suspects from the lower ranks, both of whom had motive, neither of whom had the access the job required. Jae-min listened to all of it without comment. Later, alone, he noted which questions Shin hadn't asked. A man genuinely trying to find a surveillance leak would have asked who else knew the coat's location that evening. Shin hadn't gone near it. He filed that thought somewhere quiet and kept moving. He moved Nia out of the street that night. Temporary, he told her. The same word he used for most things he hadn't fully decided yet. The apartment was small and clean, a serviced unit 3 floors above a laundry business in a district nobody associated with him. She stood in the middle of the main room for a moment after he left, looking at a bed, a window, a door with a working lock, and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not relief exactly. Something more fragile than that. She had just fallen asleep, for the first time in weeks, on something that wasn't concrete, when her phone lit up. Unknown number. She opened it. If you want to know why your father really died, meet alone. Come without telling him. Her breath stopped. Her father had died in a factory accident 5 years ago. The company had given the family a document and a small settlement and closed the case before anyone thought to question it. She read the message twice, and then she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, phone in her hand, and understood for the first time that she had not walked into the middle of something by accident. She had been walking toward it for years. The question wasn't whether to go. It was how much of the truth she was ready to carry. She showed Jae-min the message in the morning. He read it once. Set the phone on the kitchen counter, then looked at her with the same measured expression he used for everything, the one that made it impossible to tell whether he was deciding or had already decided. It's a trap, he said. Maybe. Not maybe. Someone who knew your father is dead, knew how to reach you, and knew to say meet alone in the same sentence. That's not a coincidence. That's construction. I know. She picked the phone back up. I'm going anyway. Something shifted slightly behind his eyes. Not anger. Closer to recognition. The look of a man who had spent years calculating risk, watching someone else simply refuse to. I'll have eyes on the location. The message said alone. I heard what the message said. She looked at him for a moment. He didn't move. She understood that this was not a negotiation. The abandoned port was 40 minutes south of the city, where the industrial waterfront dissolved into disused infrastructure, rusted cranes, broken dock planking, the hollow shells of warehouses that had been emptied by economic tide and never refilled. She arrived on foot as the sun dropped behind the container stacks and the light went gray and flat. A man stepped out from behind a support column near the waterline. He was older. Heavy work hands. The kind of weathering that came from decades outdoors and not enough sleep. He looked at her face the way people looked at someone they recognized from a photograph taken long ago. You look like him, he said. Her throat tightened. Tell me. He didn't waste time. 5 years ago, he had worked the night shift at a port 30 kilometers east of here. Her father had been a dock supervisor there, honest, careful, the kind of man who kept his own records because he didn't fully trust the official ones. He had noticed discrepancies in a recurring shipment, manifests that didn't match weight, containers that were logged as cleared before they'd been inspected, routes that made no logistical sense unless you understood what was actually moving through them. Illegal arms. And the same network threading through the warehouse Nia had been logging 3 days ago. Her father had compiled documentation. He had gone to the Port Authority. When that went nowhere, he had gone to a contact who promised to take it higher. 2 weeks later, someone tampered with his brake lines. The company filed it as operator error. The settlement agreement had a non-disclosure clause her mother had signed without a lawyer present. Too exhausted by grief and too afraid by the implicit pressure of people who knew where they lived. Nia stood very still while he finished speaking. The water moved behind him. The light kept going. Who was his contact? She asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The person he gave the documentation to. The dock worker opened his mouth. Headlights swept across the dock, not Jae-min's vehicles. 3 of them. Wrong formation. Coming in too fast and then stopping with the deliberate arrangement of people who wanted exits covered. Men stepped out. She counted 5. The dock worker moved back toward the column, and she understood immediately. He hadn't been followed. She had. Park's new project, one of them said, looking at her. Not asking. Stating. We don't want you. We want him to come and get you. She heard it before she saw it. The low engine note she'd registered outside the tower 11 days ago. Black SUVs entering from the north side of the lot. 2 of them. Jae-min stepped out without hurrying. The standoff lasted perhaps 20 seconds, long enough for each side to finish its calculation. Then the rival crew moved back toward their vehicles with the controlled retreat of people choosing a better moment. But the last one through the door turned back and put it into the dark like a stone into water, aimed at her. You don't know what your father was protecting. The headlights disappeared. Jae-min stood across the dock, watching the space where they had been. When he finally looked at her, something had shifted in his face. Not quite guilt, not quite grief. Something older than both. She had come to the port looking for the story of her father's death. She was beginning to understand she'd found the story of his life, and Jae-min Park was already in it. He built the map alone. Jae-min did it the way he did most things he didn't want witnessed. methodically, in the hours between midnight and 4 a.m., using paper rather than a screen. 4 events. 4 nodes. He connected them not by instinct, but by access. Who had it, when, and what that overlap produced. The tracker removed before the wallet drop required someone who knew his code, his schedule, and which pocket held the device. Inner circle. Small list. The weapons planted under Nia's intake number. Required someone who knew the bay, for shipment was problematic, knew her assignment, and had enough standing in the warehouse that no one questioned him on camera after hours. Do-hyun had planted it. But Do-hyun didn't have the organizational intelligence to construct the tracker operation. He was an executor. Someone had instructed him. The rival crew at the port. Coordinated, pre-positioned, already knowing she would be used as leverage. That kind of coordination required advanced knowledge of her movement. The only people who knew about the anonymous message were Nia, himself, and whoever he'd told when he dispatched the SUVs. He'd told one person, his operations advisor, Shin, the burned sleeping spot, 3 days before the port, before Do-hyun was removed, before anyone knew how far the thread would pull. Someone had moved on Nia early, trying to push her out before she saw anything more. Shin had been in the room when Kang reported her flagging the discrepancy. He'd been the one to say she's new, probably just confused, and move the conversation on. Jae-min set down his pen. Every event had the same radius. And at the center of all of them was a man who had been inside this organization for 15 years, who knew its architecture better than almost anyone, and who had recently, quietly, been building relationships with 3 lieutenants who reported directly to Jae-min. Not loyalty. Succession. Yet he pulled Shin's financials through a contact who owed him a silence. The irregularities weren't dramatic. Shin was too careful for that. But there were transfers, routed through 2 shell entities, that landed in an account connected to the rival network that had shown up at the port. Not a direct line, plausibly deniable. But there, if you knew what you were looking for and were willing to follow it to the end. Jae-min was always willing to follow things to the end. The meeting was private. No guards, no Kang. Just the 2 of them in the same glass-walled office where Nia had returned the wallet 10 days ago, which felt to Jae-min like a choice the building had made on his behalf. He laid 3 documents on the table. He said nothing. Shin looked at them, but his composure held for a long moment, long enough that a less patient man might have believed it. Then his eyes moved to the financial transfer record, and something in his jaw changed by a degree. The network needed stability, he said. His voice was controlled, but the framing had shifted, no longer deflecting, now explaining, justifying. Your approach is unsustainable, too exposed, too personal. He looked up. I wasn't destroying what you built. I was preparing to preserve it. By handing my location to people who would have killed me. Shin said nothing. By framing a homeless girl with no resources and no protection. Still nothing. By burning whatever she owned so she'd have nowhere to go. The silence confirmed everything the documents had only implied. 2 men entered without knocking. Shin stood slowly, straightening his jacket, with the habitual composure of a man who had decided how he would carry himself through whatever came next. At the door he paused. You should know, he said, without turning fully around. I was only one part of this. The network doesn't stop because you stopped me. A beat. It's bigger than you think. Bigger than your father's operation. Bigger than hers. The door closed. Jae-min stood in the quiet room for a moment. Bigger than hers. He thought about a dock worker at an abandoned port, about brake lines and non-disclosure agreements, and a girl who had grown up believing her father died carelessly. He thought about how long this had been running. Do-hyun had been the hand. Shin had been the mind. But someone had given them both their instructions, and that person was still out there. The retaliation came in 3 waves, and none of them looked like violence. The first was the warehouse. Not a raid this time. Subtler. A fuel line in the generator room was partially severed, clean enough that it read as wear rather than sabotage. A shipment of legitimate goods was rerouted mid-transit using forged internal orders, creating a gap in the legal inventory that would look, on paper, like theft from inside. And a fire suppression system was quietly disabled in Bay 3, where the most sensitive documentation was stored. If the building had caught for any reason, the records would have gone first. Kang found the fuel line by accident. The rerouted shipment was flagged by a carrier contact. The suppression system was discovered during a routine check that Jae-min had ordered precisely because he expected something like this. But the network was trying to destabilize without direct confrontation. Deniable damage. The kind that eroded credibility slowly rather than burning it all at once. The second wave was public. An anonymous tip reached 2 business journalists simultaneously. Documents suggesting Jaemin's legitimate holdings were being used to launder proceeds from arms trafficking. The documents were fabricated, but carefully. They were designed to generate questions that couldn't be quickly answered, to force denial cycles and legal response times that would occupy his attention and signal to investors that the ground was shifting. The third wave was quieter still. 2 of his board-level partners in the legitimate holding company received private communications suggesting they considered distancing themselves from the Park portfolio. No threats, just suggestions, delivered through intermediaries who could not be traced back to anyone. Jae-min read the pattern and understood it. The network wasn't trying to destroy him. It was trying to make him too expensive to protect. Naya found the thread. She wasn't looking for it directly. She'd been given access to the holding company's accounts as part of her new logistics role, tasked with reconciling discrepancy reports from the warehouse incident. She was working through 3 months of receivables when she noticed a vendor code that appeared in both the legitimate ledger and a secondary record from the arms shipment documentation Jae-min had given her to cross-reference. Same code, different entities, but the payment cadence was identical. Same intervals, same amounts with minor variations, and the kind of mirroring that happened when 2 accounting systems were being managed by the same hand. She flagged it without saying anything, then she followed it. The vendor code resolved to a shell company registered in a port jurisdiction. That shell company had received investment from a holding entity. That holding entity had 3 corporate board members, 2 of whom were also investors in Park's own legitimate portfolio. She sat with that for a long time. Then she walked it to Jae-min. He read through what she'd mapped, methodically, without interrupting. And when he reached the last page, he stayed still for a moment, in a way she was beginning to recognize. Not hesitation, processing. "You trace this from a receivables discrepancy," he said. "The cadence was wrong. Payments that regular usually mean the same person is scheduling both sides." He looked at the board names. 2 men he'd shared rooms with. 2 men who had attended his father's funeral. "They're not just funding the rival network," he said. Not a question. "They're directing it," she said. "The gang at the port, the media leak, the warehouse interference. It's all downstream of the same capital source. The rival crew is contracted. These are the clients." The room held that for a moment. Jae-min set the pages down. When he looked at her, something had settled in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not warmth, still, but a kind of weight, That meant he had stopped calculating her and started including her. How long to build this into something usable? 2 days, she said. Maybe less. The gang with the guns had never been the war. The war had been wearing a suit the entire time. And it had been sitting in his boardroom. The documentation Nia built over 41 hours was 63 pages long. She worked through both nights at the table in the apartment above the laundry, cross-referencing payment cadences against corporate filings, Shell registration records, and the warehouse intake discrepancies she'd flagged in her first week. The arms network had been running for 9 years through 4 jurisdictions and 11 holding entities. It had survived previous investigations because no one had ever connected the port-level logistics to the board-level capital. The criminal side and the investment side had been kept in separate rooms by design. She put them in the same room. Jae-min handed the file to 2 contacts, a financial crimes investigator he had quietly cultivated for years, and a prosecutor who had been trying to build this exact case from the other direction and had been missing the middle section. The documentation filled it. Arrest warrants were executed on a Tuesday, early, before markets opened. The first wave hit the boardroom. 2 men, the investors whose vendor codes had threaded through both ledgers, whose capital had funded a gang as a subcontractor, whose communications had directed the media leak and the warehouse interference and the suggestion letters to Jae-min's partners, were taken from their offices within 40 minutes of each other. Neither had time to move assets. The financial seizures followed the arrests by 6 hours. The freezing accounts across 3 jurisdictions before the network's legal team had assembled in the same room. The rival gang was dismantled the same morning in an operation coordinated across 2 precincts using intelligence Nia's accounting trail had made precise enough to be legally actionable. 14 arrests. The port operation that had been running since before her father's death. That had been the source, the engine, the thing he had tried to report, was shut down before noon. She heard about it from Jae-min. He called her, which he had never done before, and said only, "It's done." Then he hung up. She sat with that for a long time. 3 weeks later, a public report was issued by the Port Authority's oversight body, the result of an investigation that the documentation had forced open. As the report confirmed what the dockworker had told her at the abandoned port, her father had identified illegal arms trafficking through official channels, had been ignored, had been offered a bribe, had refused, and had been killed by deliberate brake line tampering carried out on behalf of people protecting the network. His name was in the report. His record was officially corrected. The settlement her mother had signed was voided. The company that had issued it no longer existed, but the record did. Chidi Osei, port supervisor, whistleblower. Not an accident. Nia read it alone, standing in the apartment kitchen, and let herself cry for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she folded the report carefully and put it in her bag. In the weeks that followed, Jae-min moved quietly and without announcement. But the illegal logistics infrastructure was dissolved. Not handed off, not restructured, dissolved. 3 of his lieutenants were given settlements and exit arrangements. The legitimate holdings were reorganized under cleaner management, with Nia brought in formally to oversee supply chain compliance, a role that had not existed before her. He didn't explain the choice publicly. He didn't need to. She understood it. She was the only person in the organization whose integrity had been tested under conditions that couldn't be manufactured. She had passed before she knew she was being watched. On the evening of the day the final seizure order was confirmed, he asked her to come to the tower. He was standing at the window when she arrived. He didn't turn immediately. Outside, the city moved the way it always had, loud, indifferent, a dense with its own business. She had stood on that street 9 weeks ago with torn sneakers and an empty stomach, watching luxury cars, and calculating whether any of the valets needed a runner. He turned and held out an envelope. She didn't take it immediately. "What is it?" "Open it." She looked at the envelope in his hand. She thought about her father, who had also been handed something once. A different kind of offer, in a different kind of room. He had refused it. She reached out and took the envelope. And this time, she was not afraid of what honest hands might hold. The sunset looked the same. That was the first thing she noticed. Standing on the rooftop of the Hansung Financial Tower, 42 floors above the street where she had once watched luxury cars arrive with the detached calculation of someone counting other people's lives. The sky did exactly what it had done 9 weeks ago. Gold light broke across the glass towers. The city went amber and long-shadowed. The financial district glittered in its own reflection. The view had not changed. She had. She was not hungry. That was the simplest version of it, and it still surprised her when she remembered, not dramatically, but the way you noticed the absence of a sound that had been constant for so long you'd stopped hearing it. The hollow stillness behind her ribs was gone. She had slept in the same bed for 3 weeks. She had eaten this morning and yesterday morning and the morning before that. These were not small things. She had just lived close enough to their opposites to know exactly how large they were. The envelope was open in her hands, 3 documents inside. She had read them 4 times already and was reading them again because some things needed to be held more than once before they became real. The first was a scholarship fund, endowed in her father's name, administered through a maritime labor foundation designated for children of port workers killed in workplace incidents. The Chiriyose Fund. His name in print again. Not in an accident report, not in a settlement clause, but in something that would keep going. Something that would carry his choice forward into lives he would never meet. The second was an employment contract. Supply Chain Compliance Director, Park Holdings' Legal Operations Division. Yet the role Jae-min had built around what she'd already proven she could do, formalized now with a salary that didn't seem real, and a title she intended to earn slowly and completely. The third was a housing deed. The apartment above the laundry business, transferred into her name. She folded them carefully and put them back. Jae-min stood a few feet away, looking at the city with his hands in his pockets. He hadn't said much since they'd come up here. He rarely said much. But she had learned to read the quality of his silences. And this one was not the cold, measuring silence of their first meeting. It was the silence of a man sitting with something he was still working out how to carry. "You could have taken the money," he said. Not an accusation. Just a fact he was still tracing the implications of. "I know. That first day, outside the gate, you had 60 seconds where nobody would have stopped you. I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" She thought about her answer honestly. Not the clean version, because my father's voice, because integrity, but the true, unglamorous version. She had stood on the pavement and felt the full pull of that money and chosen not to, in the same way she chose every day not to become a version of herself she couldn't live inside. "Because some things cost more than they're worth," she said, "even when you're starving." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that somewhere it would be useful. Below them, the street moved. People crossed at the intersection where she had once stood with torn sneakers and calculated the valets. A woman walked past the spot where the wallet had landed, as cars moved through the amber light without stopping. If she had taken the money that day, she would have disappeared into the city's current. Invisible. Surviving. Unremarkable. The corruption would have continued. The network would have kept running. her father's name would have stayed buried under a company's paperwork. And Jamin Park would have walked through his own organization's betrayal without ever knowing the shape of the trap closing around him. She had changed none of it by being powerful. She had changed all of it by being honest. One choice, made on an empty stomach in 30 seconds, with shaking hands. Jae-min turned from the railing and looked at her, not with the evaluating stillness of a man calculating risk, but with something plainer and harder to name. Recognition, maybe. And the look of someone who had spent a long time in rooms full of people who could be bought and had stopped expecting anything different. "You see what others miss," he said quietly. "You always did." He went back inside. She stayed on the rooftop a little longer, watching the light change over the city. Somewhere below, her father's name was on a document that told the truth. Somewhere in the organization, the illegal infrastructure had been cut away like dead weight. Somewhere in the system, the men who had turned arms into assets and people into risks were in rooms with lawyers and no good answers. None of it had required her to become something she wasn't. It had only required her to stay exactly what she was, even when the world made staying costly. The Mafia boss dropped his wallet and thought he lost something small. But what he actually lost was the version of himself that trusted no one. And what Nia found, standing hungry on a pavement with 30 seconds to decide, was not luck, not opportunity, not a powerful man's gratitude. She found confirmation of something her father had always known. Sometimes the poorest person carries the one thing the powerful fear most: a conscience that cannot be bought. And that changes everything. If this story moved you, if you believe honesty still has power in a world full of corruption, take a second and like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that doing the right thing is never a weakness. And subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories about courage, integrity, and the quiet people who change the world without even trying. Oh, because sometimes one small choice doesn't just change a life, it changes everything.